In the second half of our examination of the rise of the fascist movements in Europe after World War I, we're going to take a look at German fascism. We'll begin by going back to the end of the First World War and the formation of a new government in Germany. Weimar was the city where the Constitutional Assembly took place that developed the Constitution for post-World War I Germany. This was a time of great chaos, politically, socially, economically. Weimar also was an important cultural center of Europe. It was home to Goethe, Schiller, Herder, Liszt, Bach, quite a few noteworthy figures in German cultural history, so there was a significance there to the city as well. The radical left didn't like the Republic. They believed it betrayed ideals of workers and the workers' movement. Conservatives didn't like the Weimar Republic. They really preferred authoritarian rule, and Weimar was anything but authoritarian. The far right believed that a conspiracy by socialists, Jews, and others led to Germany's defeat in the First World War. So there were many groups who were disenchanted with the new government. The Constitution itself called for very forward-looking progressive ideas like universal suffrage, direct election of representatives, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, freedom of press. The right to own property was guaranteed. So this wasn't a radical left sort of document. It was in the classical liberal tradition. Women's rights and women's suffrage were guaranteed under the Constitution. So very advanced for the time period. Article 48 was an interesting clause, and some would call a fatal flaw in the Weimar Constitution, where the president could rule by decree during emergencies. In the period from 1920 to 1923, the German economy really went into a tailspin. Many folks out of work. Those with money found safer havens for their investments. Frequent strikes, and a period of hyperinflation almost unparalleled in world history, at least until the recent implosion of the Zimbabwean economy. This chart shows the decrease in time of the German mark. 1914 in July, just before the start of the First World War, as the baseline for the German mark. And by 1923, you can see 1 mark in 1914 would be worth 726 billion marks at the end of 1923. In part because of the implosion of the German economy and their inability to pay reparations as stipulated by the Treaty of Versailles, the French actually invaded Germany in this region known as the Ruhr. The goal was to force the Germans to pay by loading up onto trains anything of value that they could find. Historians are kind of split over the effectiveness of this tactic, whether or not the French really profited from the occupation of the Ruhr, but it certainly forced changes in among world leaders as to what the Germans would be required to do with reparations. It is at this time that Adolf Hitler found his opportunity to make something with the party that he was associated with at the time. Hitler, if you're unfamiliar, is actually Austrian, grew up in a different country, although a German-speaking country. Prior to the start of the First World War, had aspirations of being an artist, although he was not accepted to art school despite his repeated efforts to gain entry. served with some distinction in the First World War, was wounded several times, including being blinded near the end of the war. But the war caused him to become rather disillusioned, like many people in Europe at the time. On the far left, you can see Adolf Hitler with one of the units with which he served during the First World War. Hitler, like many in the German military, and many Germans, civilian Germans as well, grew to believe in this idea of the Dolchstoßlegende. It translates roughly as the stab in the back legend. It's a belief by the far right in Germany at the time that it was Jews and socialists and communists who were really responsible for Germany's defeat in World War I. Germany had a unique situation at the end of the First World War in that foreign troops hadn't occupied very much German territory at all. So to people in Germany, it was puzzling that they could lose the war, and yet foreign troops really didn't make inroads into Germany. Typically, the way a war was fought at that time was you would drive to the capital city and plant your flag to show the defeated people that you had really conquered them. So to Germans, the idea that they lost the war was puzzling, and they were trying to find answers to explain this puzzle. Among many paramilitary groups that emerged after the First World War in response to the actions of the left, there were again a number of failed revolutions throughout Europe at the end of the First World War. The names of the essay, the Sturmabteilung, translates as a storm section. They're also known by the color of the clothing they wore, that is the brown shirts. Many of these were ex-soldiers. Many of them were sort of street thugs, not afraid whatsoever to use violence to meet their goals. And Hitler at this time was very much a devotee or a follower of Benito Mussolini. He saw the effectiveness of Mussolini's tactics, although he didn't realize the behind-the-scenes deal-making. He just saw what he knew was in the newspapers, was that Mussolini marched on Rome. And he had a similar vision that he, too, could lead a movement that would march on Berlin so he could take power. Following in the footsteps of Benito Mussolini, Hitler planned what was known as the Beer Hall Putsch, or an attempt to gather forces in Munich and march to Berlin. It was led by Adolf Hitler. Interestingly, one of the leading generals from the First World War, Erich Ludendorff, was involved in this, although he later tried to disavow himself at a subsequent trial. The planned revolution didn't occur as Hitler had planned, and most of the conspirators were rounded up and put on trial. It's during the trial of Adolf Hitler that, interestingly, he rises to his greatest prominence in Germany. He was tried for high treason. The trial began in February of 1924 before a special People's Court in Munich, and he was sentenced to 5 years in prison at Landsberg prison. He was pardoned relatively quickly, and this is an interesting mistake on the part of the Weimar government. They didn't want Hitler to be seen as a martyr. He actually, in total, spent less than a year in prison, despite the state prosecutor's objections. But he spent several weeks on the stand, and the Weimar government, very eager to make it look as fair of a trial as possible, allowed him to just get up and talk about the putsch, or the coup d'etat. And Hitler didn't spend any time on actually defending himself in a legal sense. He argued that his actions were justified, that the government was a failure, the economy was collapsed, and it was his duty as a patriotic German to stand up and fight for what he believed was right. And there are many anecdotal accounts of reporters in the courtroom who said that they were moved by his speech, that even the judge himself was nodding and in agreement during the trial. So it turned out to be a public relations boon for Hitler. While in prison, he dictated his memoirs, known as Mein Kampf, or My Struggle. And the original title, I'm sure the editor talked him into chopping it down to something a little more easy for readers to follow, was something like 4.5 years of struggle against lies, stupidity, and cowardice. Originally, it was not a bestseller. By the time the book hit the press, the German economy had turned around a little bit, and Adolf had sort of fallen out of the public eye. But as he rose to power, more and more people began to buy the book. He earned millions of Reichsmarks in income from this, and by the end of the Second World War, over 10 million copies of the book had been sold or distributed in Germany. One of the ways he made money after he became the leader of Germany was that he would give away a copy to married couples. Of course, he gave it away, but the government paid for it, and he made out quite well in this book. Some quick overviews of Mein Kampf. Going back to the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche, the idea of the Übermensch, or the Overman. These are people, if you follow this philosophy, who are so self-actualized they are above the average person. In a way, they've almost become a new being. So he definitely bought into this idea. Believed he, of course, was a Nietzschean Übermensch. Not surprisingly, there's a great deal of anti-Semitism in there, and reiterating his ideas that it was Jews and leftists, or Jews and Bolsheviks, who wanted to control the world. He lays out some ideas of what he called Lebensraum, or living room, that the German people needed more space, and the place he was going to look would be east. Ideas about racial hierarchy and racial purity are found in here. But interestingly, Hitler had come to the conclusion, I guess nothing like spending a little time in prison to cool your jets, that for the Nazis to succeed, they must follow legal means to power. No more coups d'etats. They must use the system to break the system. Elected president in 1925 was Paul von Hindenburg, who had led the German military along with Erich Ludendorff during the First World War. He was rather old at this time. He was 78 years old when he was elected president. As time went on, as we all do, he aged, was suffering from numerous health problems, and toward the end of his life and his rule as president, he was increasingly senile. Under the German system, the people elected the president. The Chancellor, which would be somewhat similar to a prime minister in Western European political traditions, was chosen from the Reichstag, which is the elected, or popularly elected, legislative branch. There were some good years in the late 1920s for the Germans and the German economy. Under the Dawes Plan, D-A-W-E-S, 1924, Germany's overall reparations were lowered. The Reichsbank was reorganized. He was also instrumental in helping put together the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928, which renounced the use of violence in international conflicts. A very talented foreign minister, a very powerful figure at a time when Germany needed sensible leadership. And unfortunately, he died at a very young age, at age 51. And there was definitely a lack of people of his stature in Germany to provide guidance to the Weimar Republic. Something of a power vacuum emerged after his death. One of the biggest factors in the rise of the Nazis to power, though, was the economy. And when times were tough in 1923, and Hitler believed the Nazis had an opportunity to take power, they nearly pulled off their dream. When the economy got better, the Nazis did not fare well, as we'll see in another slide. But you can see in this information presented here that unemployment in Germany was as high as any of the major nations in the world during the Great Depression, and higher than most. It's not surprising that when the economy was going well, the Nazis did not fare well. In the Reichstag elections, 1928 came in 7th place. But as the Great Depression unfolded, you can see they got more electoral success in 1930 and 1932. By November of 32, it seemed to many observers at the time that the Nazis were beginning to peak, or had already peaked, and Hitler became nervous that his party did not fare as well in the November elections, and there was a sense of urgency to his desire to take power. Hitler had previously refused several offers to make him a cabinet minister. He wanted nothing less than to become Chancellor, or Reichschancellor. And he did find a completely legal means to power. Unfortunately for world history, Hitler was not as easy as his opponents thought in terms of being controlled. And he worked very quickly once he got into power to consolidate his power. Almost immediately after taking power, an event occurred that worked very much to Hitler's benefit. The Reichstag building caught fire. To this day, we're not quite sure who set the fire. There was one person arrested who was executed for the crime. But Marinus van der Lubbe was not, shall we say, the brightest bulb in the box. He was a rather simple-minded and perhaps mentally ill laborer of Dutch origin. He was affiliated with Dutch communists. It is possible that he set the fire himself, but forensic historians and observers at the time came to the conclusion it would be very difficult for one person to have set so many different fires within this building in such a short period of time. Theories range from this being a true communist conspiracy to being a false flag operation on the part of the Nazis, that they perhaps duped this dim-witted laborer into a plot. Personally, I think Hitler was not part of this if it was a Nazi operation. All accounts seem to suggest he was surprised and shocked, at least at first, when he arrived on the scene to see the Reichstag building in flames. But the net result is this was a tremendous opportunity for Hitler, whether or not he was actually behind it or just took advantage of the Reichstag fire. And that Article 48 that we had talked about earlier, which is akin to martial law, was invoked. And one of Hitler's first moves, since this was, as he put it, a socialist, communist, Bolshevik, Jewish conspiracy, was to have these folks locked up. Here's a picture of Marinus van der Lubbe, or a series of pictures. Again, a very unfortunate character. Probably was involved in some way with the burning of the Reichstag building. but it's unlikely that this this unfortunate person could have pulled this off all by himself, and quite possible that the Nazis themselves may have been involved in this. One of the first acts that Hitler passes, and again just in weeks after the Reichstag fire, is something known as the Enabling Act. And because many of the socialist and communist members of the Reichstag were in jail as a result of this Article 48 being enacted, there was a much smaller Reichstag, and essentially this gave Hitler dictatorial powers. And from this point forward, again, Hitler's goal was to have a completely legal means to power, and he achieved it. Now, you can argue that the use of brown-shirted thugs to intimidate political opponents, the use of widespread violence, is not a legal act in and of itself, but the physical means of gaining office and achieving power were all by completely legal methods. Hitler faced rivals not only on the political left, but also on the far right and within fascist movements in Germany. The Night of the Long Knives, or Nacht, langen was an effort by Hitler and the Nazis to eliminate political rivals within the SA, the Sturmabteilung, or the brown shirts. Remember that the Nazis and the SA were separate organizations. Many Nazis were members of the SA, many members of the SA were members of the Nazi Party, but they were separate, distinct organizations. By 1934, Hitler, perhaps in a moment of paranoia, perhaps with some basis for concern, believed that the leader of the brown shirts, Ernst Röhm, and his subordinates were planning a coup d'etat against him. The death toll was probably in the 300 to 400 range. Thousands of SA members were arrested. Most of the killings were carried out by a new paramilitary group that Hitler had developed, the SS and the Gestapo. Hitler had the cabinet approve a measure on July 3rd. The action began on June 30th of 1934. That declared that the measures taken on June 30th, July 1st, and July 2nd to suppress treasonous assaults are legal as acts of self-defense by the state. He, of course, had the ability to influence the Reichstag and could rule without them, but this gave him a measure of political legitimacy, or legal legitimacy, for an act that was really, in many ways, cold-blooded murder of political opponents. The last potential source of rivalry, although a weakened, emaciated, and increasingly senile rival, was Paul von Hindenburg, and his death in 1934 completed Hitler's rise to power and consolidation of power. Hitler, of course, gave him a fantastic sending-off party at the Tannenberg Memorial in 1934. From this point forward, there were no significant rivals to Hitler's power. Let's briefly discuss why the Nazi Party arrives in power. First and foremost, you have to give credit to Hitler for being a charismatic figure and an excellent orator. But the Nazis themselves, the NSDAP, or National Socialist Workers' Party of Germany, was very good at grassroots organization. We've talked about some of the mistakes made by German politicians believing they could rein in Hitler or use him for their own ends. But the Weimar Republic itself, being politically fragmented, was really in no position to deal with the severity of the Great Depression. Nazi propaganda was extremely innovative and made use of new media like radio and the cinema to push Nazi ideology. The Germans themselves had a relatively lengthy history of strong rulers, so the idea of a dictator-like person was not necessarily so foreign to Germans. And even in democracies, from time to time, when times are difficult, people will rally around a strong leader, thinking that a strong leader might get them out of the predicament with which they are in. We mentioned Article 48, again, the idea that the president could decree a state of emergency, and Hitler was able to convince Paul von Hindenburg that such a state of emergency occurred after the Reichstag fire. Communists at the time were seen as a greater threat than the Nazis, and industrialists believed the Nazis could help rein in what they feared as a communist revolution or potential for communist revolution. The Treaty of Versailles itself, some have called it a flawed document. Observers at the time even questioned the severity of reparations. But the perception is reality here, and Germans in the main believed the Treaty of Versailles to be an extremely unfair document. They believed the guilt for the war should be shared among many nations, not just Germany. And finally, you have to factor in the component of luck. Hitler was a gambler, and there were a number of times where he gambled, and the dice seemed to always roll in his favor, at least in the early years of his rise to power.